Did you know that there was such a thing as the Immigration Restriction League? Yeah, that was a thing. For a country called the Melting Pot, they sure were exclusionary. Let's talk about the Immigration Restriction League. The Immigration Restriction League was an American nativist and anti immigration organization. To level set, nativists are people who promote or protect the interests of native born or indigenous people over those of immigrants, including the support of anti immigration and immigration restriction measures. Now, in the United States, nativism does not refer to a movement led by Native Americans. It refers to white people protecting white people from non white people because they think that non whites were born outside of the United States. Seriously, that's what they think. That anyone born non white was born outside of the United States. Not so fun fact. The citizens of Bisbee, Arizona, the white male citizens of Bisbee, Arizona, forcibly deported Mexican Americans, some of whom were citizens and served in World War I because they didn't have jobs and they were Mexican Americans. Yeah, yeah. Mind you, these were men, women, and children who had been in this country and citizens since the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. They were citizens. But they were repatriated to Mexico because these white men determined that they weren't citizens. So, and do you know what the federal government did? Nothing. That's it. Nothing. But I digress. Now, the League was founded during the increasing anti immigration sentiment in the United States. The goal was to prevent immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe from immigrating to the United States due to a belief that they were racially inferior to Western and Northern Europeans. The League argued that the American way of life was threatened by immigration from these regions. The League lobbied for anti immigration legislation restricting the entry of what they perceived as undesirable immigrants in order to uphold old stock American hegemony. Old stock Americans is code for Americans who were descended from the original 13 colonies, mainly white Protestants from Northern Europe whose ancestors immigrated from British America in the 17th and 18th centuries. According to Professor of History Erica Lee, in 1894, the old stock Yankee upper class founders of the League were convinced that Anglo Saxon traditions, peoples, and culture were being drowned in a flood of racially inferior foreigners from Southern and Eastern Europe. The League advocated for a literacy requirement to limit poorly educated immigrants who would lower the wage scale. I don't understand how they would lower the wage scale. Employers set the wages, but whatever. Congress passed the literacy bill for the first time in 1896, which set the ability to read at least 40 words in any language as a requirement for admission to the United States. President Grover Cleveland vetoed the bill in 1897. President William Taft also vetoed a literacy test in 1913, again in 1915. President Woodrow Wilson vetoed a bill But in 1917, Congress overrode Wilson's veto and instituted the first literacy requirement for naturalization as part of the Immigration Act of 1917. The League lobbied for the Immigration Act of 1917, which aimed to restrict immigration by imposing literacy tests on immigrants, creating new categories of inadmissible persons, and barring immigration from the Asian Pacific Zone. The act designated an Asiatic barred zone from which people could not immigrate, including much of Asia and the Pacific Islands. It excluded immigrants from China, British India, Afghanistan, Arabia, Myanmar, Thailand, and the Malay states, the Dutch East Indies, the Soviet Union east of the Ural Mountains, and most Polynesian islands. The act would be updated to include Japan in the Immigration Act of 1924. The ban on Asians would be lifted in 1952 with the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, known as the McCarran-Walter Act. It extended the privilege of naturalization to Japanese, Koreans, and other Asians. The Immigration Restriction League would disband after one of the founders, Prescott F. Hall, passed away in 1921.